I've heard that life is what you make it. I say, make room to grow. I'm your host, LaWanda Dockery, and this is the Make Room to Grow podcast. It all started with a dream about growing food, and who would ever imagine that growing food would lead to me learning about personal growth and development? Well, it did, and I want to bring you along for this beautiful ride. Thank you so much for joining me. Hey, Grow Nation. This week we are talking all about containers as promised. There are so many options when you're starting out. Let's just demystify it all, and I'll tell you to start with some solo cups. Not only are they inexpensive, but they work. You'll find a lot of different options, but this seemed to be the simplest and proven most successful for me last year. Once you get the cups, what you will want to do is cut holes on either sides of the bottom of the cup, and that's what you'll use for drainage. You'll also be able to water them from the bottom, which will prevent them from being damaged or dislodged. You will notice that there are other options, but I found these the easiest to maneuver. There are smaller biodegradable trays that you can start out with, but you run the risk of damaging the plants when you go to transplant them into a bigger cup like the solo cups. So it's best just to start in there. And what you'll learn is that the plants will be healthier by the time you put them in a larger container. You want to leave them undisturbed for as long as possible so that they can grow healthily. I used the window box to grow lettuce, and I sowed those seeds directly into the window box. Lettuce grows quickly, as I mentioned before, so there was no need to put it into a larger container. I was only going to harvest from that container that I grew it in. You'll find as you get going with this, you'll look at every container as a possibility. One time I took a fruit juice carton and I cut out the top of it and I used the spout for a drainage hole, and it worked perfectly fine for my lettuce. So don't be afraid to experiment with this either. I also used concrete mixer containers. I saw that on a YouTube video and the idea worked perfectly. I used it for kale and for collard greens. So be creative as to what you use. There's also much conversation around which containers are more safe to use than others. I would recommend that you use food grade containers if you have any questions at all as to which are the safest. That way you'll know. It's marked on the bucket itself, usually 5-gallon containers, that it's safe for food. When in doubt, go with that method. With all of these options, whether it's the buckets, whether it's the window box, whether it's the carton, you must have drainage, proper drainage. So you need to take a drill, or if you don't have a drill, use a screwdriver, but put adequate drainage holes in the bottom. If you have a 5-gallon bucket, I would say at least use 6 to 10 holes in the bottom just to make sure that you're getting proper drainage. If you're using the window box, you'll see the indentations or the markings for where you should put the holes. Follow those guys. At any rate, whatever you use, make sure you have proper drainage. You don't want your plants to sit and water because it'll rot the roots. One way to avoid that is to check the level of moisture in the soil. You can take your 2 fingers and scratch back the surface to see whether or not the soil is still dark and moist when you scratch it back. If it's not, then you know that you need to add water, or you need to sit it in water so that it can get adequate moisture. You never want your containers to dry out. You always want to check those levels. At the same time, you do not want it to sit in water because you want your root system to be healthy and you don't want it to rot. That will destroy your plants. You'll need to be patient and super attentive while the plants are in this stage, because this is when they're most delicate. You don't want them to be in too much sunlight so that it burns it out. You don't want it to sit in too much water so that it drowns it. You don't want it to get too dry so that it starves the plant out. So you need to just be attentive every day. Make sure that you're paying attention for signs of something not being in proper balance. Overall, I want you to be confident that you will get through this to harvest, that you will have something on your plate that you grew for yourself when this is all said and done. It'll just take patience and consistency. When you're starting out, it'll look nothing like the end product. I want you to remain encouraged. Just know that this is a day-by-day journey. Before my eyes got trained to what was really appropriate or healthy in this world, I thought that my little seedlings were the best seedlings moving until I started to see pictures of other healthier ones. I saw that mine were leggy, they were reaching toward the sunlight, they were way too thin, and they weren't looking that healthy after all. But those are the very seeds that made it through to harvest. I want to go back to talking about containers. How can we apply this to our everyday life? What can we extrapolate from this exercise of talking about containers? What can we apply to our lives? I noticed that when I first started to think about choosing the various containers for starting out these seeds, I had no clue about the root systems or how big they end up being eventually. And what I noticed is that the bigger the container that I put the seeds in, the bigger the capacity for growth. When I started in the really small little packs, the little cartons that I told you about, I noticed that they would be really compacted and the roots would start to grow out of the bottom hole of those trays. Then I noticed when I use a slightly larger pot or when I let the starter plant sit in the container for too long, it started to spiral around itself. The roots started to spiral around itself, and it almost looked like it was forming in the shape of the container. And it dawned on me, I need to start these in a larger container because the smaller the container, the more it inhibited the growth of the plant. How does that matter, you say? I'm thinking about our lives and what does it look like when we put ourselves in a container that's too small? What does it look like when we box ourselves in and we don't allow ourselves and our root systems to grow? We kind of go around and we spiral in circles and it chokes us out. It's what we call rootbound in the gardening world, where the roots have nowhere to go. They circle around itself and it eventually chokes itself out. It chokes the plant out. How can we change that in our lives? What can we look at? I always say, look at ways that you can be intentional about making room to grow. But literally, when we're talking about containers, take this podcast, for example. This is a brand new container for me. I've always been creative, but I've always did that in the form of writing. And now I get a chance to talk and speak and share my thoughts that I normally would write down on paper. Well, this is a whole new container that I'm just excited about. It seems inexhaustible that there's no shortage of things to talk about. There's no shortage of things that I want to impart to you or share with you by way of my experiences. And it's a new container. I'm the same me. I'm just as authentic as I ever was when I'm writing or any other vein that I would be expressing myself in. But now this is a new, larger space. So I just want to impart that to you. Look around your life and think of ways that you can expand the container that your life is in. Maybe you've always done one thing in one modality, but perhaps you can let this be the season that you say, hey, I want to venture out. I want to do something different. I want to expand my borders. I want to stretch myself. I want to learn a new skill. What I learned with this is that as I went and delved into learning about how to grow food, I learned a new language. I learned a new cadence. I learned a new community. I learned different jargon, just a whole new set of experiences because I decided to immerse myself in this new world and I learned something new. So I just want to encourage you and provoke you to put your thinking caps on. This is your homework for this episode. Think of ways that you could do things differently. You could put yourself in a new container. You can take off the lid, take off the constraint, push out the walls of the boundaries that you already have for yourself or how you view yourself or maybe that you've been told about yourself and kick against that. And I want you to just look at ways that you can grow and you can flourish and become more fruitful. Thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, I want you to think about ways that you can be intentional about making room to grow.